I wasn't the type to get sentimental over high school, but flipping through my freshly printed yearbook brought back a weird mix of nostalgia and relief. Graduation was only a few days away, and I was more than ready to move on. I was lying on my bed, absent-mindedly scanning the pages, laughing at dumb inside jokes scribbled by my friends. That's when I noticed something off. There was a picture from the homecoming game, one of those wide shots capturing the student section. Something about the crowd made me squint. There, in the back, barely visible but unmistakable, was a man. He wasn't cheering, wasn't even dressed like a student or a parent. He just stood there, slightly blurred, like he wasn't supposed to be in the shot. I flipped a few more pages. Another candid, this one from a pep rally. My stomach sank. He was there again, standing in the back near the gym doors. Same blank expression, same posture. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe a teacher, a staff member. But something about him felt wrong. I turned the pages faster now, scanning random photos. There he was at the senior bonfire. A group of students were laughing, their faces illuminated by the flames, and just outside the firelight's reach, the man stood watching. No one acknowledged him. No one even seemed to notice he was there. I felt my pulse quicken. It wasn't until I reached the group photos that the unease turned to outright fear. I found the picture of me and my friends, taken on the last day of school. We were all standing in front of the lockers, arms slung over each other's shoulders, smiling. But right behind us, slightly out of focus, was the man. He was standing directly behind me. And this time, he was smiling too. A cold shiver ran through my body. I slammed the yearbook shut. My heart was racing, but I kept telling myself it was some weird editing mistake. Maybe someone photoshopped him in as a joke. Maybe it was just some random guy who had been around and no one noticed. I tried to put it out of my head. That night, while packing for college, my phone buzzed with a text. I'd assumed it was one of my friends making plans for graduation, but when I checked the screen, my stomach dropped. Unknown number. See you at graduation. I just stared at it, my hands suddenly clammy. My brain fought between wanting to dismiss it as a prank and the overwhelming dread creeping up my spine. I typed back, "Who is this?" No response. I didn't sleep much that night. Every shadow in my room felt too dark, every sound too sharp. I even checked the locks twice before finally forcing myself to lie down. The next day at school, I asked around. No one else seemed to notice the man in the yearbook. Not my friends, not the teachers. Even the yearbook staff had no idea who I was talking about. They pulled up the raw files, and in the original shots, he wasn't there. But in the printed copies, he was. I tried to brush it off, to pretend none of it mattered. Graduation day came, and the whole ceremony felt like a blur. It wasn't until after I walked across the stage, diploma in hand, that I saw him again, standing at the very back of the auditorium. He was grinning. And this time, he raised his hand, just slightly, and waved. I left town the next morning. I don't know who he was, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I still get messages from an unknown number. I never answer them. I still think about this night sometimes. Even years later, the memory creeps back when I least expect it. I was never the kind of person to believe in the paranormal, but what happened at my college graduation made me question everything. It was a warm evening, and the ceremony was being held outdoors on the university's football field. Rows of white chairs stretched across the grass, each filled with anxious graduates dressed in identical caps and gowns. I was sitting toward the middle, waiting for my name to be called. The air buzzed with nervous excitement. Occasional bursts of laughter, the murmurs of students whispering to each other. The occasional call of a professor reminding us to stay in line. At first, it was just a passing observation, something my brain registered but didn't dwell on. a girl, sitting at the very end of the row. She was wearing a cap and gown like the rest of us, but something about her was off. Her skin was unnaturally pale, almost grayish under the stadium lights. And she sat perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't fidget, didn't whisper to anyone, didn't even seem to blink. I kept stealing glances at her, feeling a weird sense of unease. It wasn't just her stillness. It was the way no one else seemed to acknowledge her. The students on either side of her left a noticeable gap, as if they were unconsciously avoiding sitting too close. The name-calling continued. One by one, students walked up, shook hands with the dean, and took their diplomas. Cheers erupted with every name. Parents, friends, classmates all clapping, shouting. But she never reacted, never clapped, never turned her head to watch. Then, it happened. The announcer cleared his throat and read a name. Anna Holloway. Silence. No claps, no cheers, not a single sound. I looked around, expecting someone to call out or react, but no one did. The announcer hesitated, shifting uncomfortably at the microphone, as if realizing something was wrong. Then, after an awkward pause, he quickly moved on to the next name, and the moment passed as if it had never happened. But I couldn't let it go. The name felt familiar, and that girl, she still hadn't moved. A strange sensation crawled up my spine, and for the first time, I noticed something else. The wind had been blowing all night, making our gowns ripple slightly as we sat. But hers didn't move at all. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. I barely registered my own name being called, my legs feeling stiff as I walked across the stage. The only thing I could focus on was her. Every time I glanced back, she was still there, still staring forward. After the final name was called and the hats were tossed into the air, I found myself scanning the crowd, searching for her, but she was gone. I hadn't seen her stand. I hadn't seen her leave. She had just vanished. Something about it gnawed at me. Maybe it was my brain trying to rationalize what I saw, or maybe it was pure unease, but I needed to know. After the ceremony, I approached one of the faculty members, an older professor who had been handing out the diplomas. I asked him, as casually as I could, who Anna Holloway was. His reaction was instant. His expression darkened, his mouth opened slightly like he wanted to say something but stopped himself. Then, after a pause, he gave a small shake of his head. She wasn't on the list. I laughed nervously, thinking he misunderstood. No, I heard her name announced. She was sitting at the end of the row. Pale girl, black hair, really quiet. The professor stared at me for a long time. Then, in a hushed voice, he said, Anna Holloway was supposed to graduate 5 years ago. She died in a car accident a week before the ceremony. A cold, heavy weight settled in my stomach. That can't be right, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I saw her. She was there. I swear. He only shook his head. I don't know what you saw, but she wasn't on the list. I left without another word. That night, I searched the university's records, digging through old class rosters. And there it was. Anna Holloway, class of 2018. My hands felt clammy as I clicked on an old article. The headline sent a chill down my spine. Tragic accident claims life of promising student days before graduation. Anna had been driving home late from a study session when her car skidded on black ice and flipped into a ditch. She had died instantly. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours. The girl I saw at graduation, her pale skin, her motionless posture, the way no one sat too close to her. It all made sense now. I closed my laptop, trying to push away the growing fear inside me. Maybe it had been a mistake. Maybe I imagined her. Maybe I was just tired. But then I remembered the silence. Every single student received cheers, claps, whistles. Except for her, Somewhere deep down, I knew. I had seen her. She had been there. And no one noticed. Except me. Graduation night had always been billed as a moment of triumph and celebration. A time to mark the end of college life and the beginning of something new. I'd remember the buzz of excitement as I donned my cap and gown, the lingering sense of perfume and sweat in the crowded auditorium, and the applause that reverberated off the walls as names were called. After the ceremony, the building emptied out quickly. Most of my classmates had already gone off to their parties or family gatherings, leaving the auditorium quiet and strangely empty. I was among the last to leave, reluctant to let go of the moment. It wasn't until I reached my car that I realized I'd left my phone charger behind. I cursed my forgetfulness. My phone was already dangerously close to dying, and I needed it for directions home. With no other option, I decided to return to the auditorium, a building that still held the echoes of the ceremony and the nervous energy of our last moments as students. Entering the auditorium again felt different in the fading light. The main hall, once brimming with life, now lay in near silence, illuminated only by a few dim emergency lights. The janitor, an older man whose tired eyes and slow, deliberate movements told of years spent alone in these halls, was busy sweeping confetti from the stage. His presence was oddly comforting in a place that otherwise felt abandoned. I retraced my steps back to my seat in the second row, where I remembered leaving my charger. With each step, I noticed the eerie hush that contrasted sharply with the celebratory chaos of just hours before. The silence was punctuated only by the soft rustle of my sneakers against the cold floor and the distant hum of the building settling. As I knelt down, reaching for my charger, a strange heaviness in the air made my skin crawl. That's when I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound that didn't match my own movements. I froze. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, echoing across the stage in a slow, measured pace. I glanced up toward the stage and saw a figure standing in the center. Dressed in a cap and gown identical to mine, the person was facing away, standing unnaturally still as if caught in a moment that defied time. At first, I thought it must be another student who'd forgotten something. A friend perhaps lost in thought or caught in the nostalgia of the night. Summoning the courage to speak, I called out, "Hey, did you forget something?" My voice wavered in the silence, uncertain if it would be met with an answer. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The figure remained motionless, and the janitor continued his slow sweep along the stage, seemingly oblivious to the strange occurrence. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, came the words. Did they say my name? I felt my heart sink into my stomach. That voice, it was hauntingly familiar. I remember the news from last summer. A student from our class had died in a tragic accident. Rumors had swirled, and the memory of that friend, whose name was never formally announced during the ceremony, had been seared into my mind. Now, before me, stood someone who should not have been there. My mind raced as I tried to comprehend what I was witnessing. The figure slowly turned its head, revealing a face that was unsettlingly blank, a face that seemed to be caught between life and something else. I couldn't tell if the eyes held remorse or if they were simply empty. I asked again, voiced barely above a whisper, "Are you okay?" But the figure did not respond with a reassuring nod or a simple yes. Instead, that chilling whisper repeated, "Did they say my name?" The repetition sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't just a question. It was an accusation, a plea, and a summons all at once. Paralysis gripped me. Every instinct screamed to flee, to run out of that building as fast as possible. Yet I stood rooted to the spot, transfixed by the unspeakable horror before me. Finally, as if the weight of dread had been too much to bear, I turned and bolted from the auditorium. I barely noticed if the janitor or any other presence was following. My only thought was escape. Outside, the cool night air never felt so welcoming as it did in that frantic moment. I didn't stop until I was safely in my car, the engine's hum a small comfort in the midst of my racing heart and frantic thoughts. I left the charger behind on that cold, empty floor, along with something else I wished I could forget. The next day, I returned to the auditorium. Half to recover my charger, half to understand what I'd witnessed. The room was as I had left it, but the charger was nowhere to be found. It was as if it had vanished into thin air, leaving only the unsettling memory of that encounter behind. To this day, I'm left with a lingering question and an unshakable sense of dread. Was it a trick of the light, my exhausted mind, or something far more sinister? A restless spirit seeking recognition on what was supposed to be a joyous night? I may never know the full truth, and perhaps that is for the best. The memory of that whispered question continues to haunt me, an eerie reminder that some moments should remain unexplained.